Yeah, thank you very much, Jan, for this kind introduction. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to see that we can meet again in person. I'm glad to present in this first workshop, this introductory workshop on post-Keynesian economics. And I've chosen a very broad topic. I've chosen a very broad topic, post-Keynesian economics, method, history, current state, and perspectives. And I would like to beg your pardon if this will be a grand overview, but it won't be comprehensive, I guess. It won't cover everything which has been done in post-Keynesian economics. And I guess that on many topics you will see more detailed presentations, more even up-to-date presentations in the 2 days or 3 days to come. Now, what I'm planning to do is, well, let me first start with this slide, which I also use in class, and I've seen some of my students here. They have seen it several times in our macro class, which I used as a first orientation to locate post-Keynesian economics in the history of thought, here in the history of thought in the area of macroeconomics. And as you see, post-Keynesian economics is part of heterodox economics, or can be seen as part of heterodox economics, together with modern Marxist macroeconomics. Of course, if we look more broader at economics, not only at macroeconomics, there are several other heterodox schools like feminist economics, ecological economics, and so on. But the focus here should be on macro. So post-Keynesian economics can be considered to be part of heterodox macroeconomics, and it is, I would claim, one of the main competitors, so to speak, of current orthodox macroeconomics, represented by modern versions of new Keynesian and new consensus macroeconomics, or modern versions of new classical macroeconomics. But I don't want to talk about these. I want to talk about post-Keynesian economics. And I first want to, and this is the slide which I'm now looking for, first want to distinguish heterodox economics from orthodox economics from a more methodological perspective, mainly following what you can find in the work of Marc Lavoie in his 2014 book. Then I want to go into the different strands of post-Keynesian economics and look for their commonalities. And I would claim that there are several commonalities of post-Keynesian economics, which makes them, or makes post-Keynesians a distinctive school, or even a distinctive paradigm in modern economics. I will then look at the different stages of development of post-Keynesian economics over time, and then we'll finish with some thoughts on the current state and maybe on the perspectives of post-Keynesian economics. And since the slides, I guess, will go online after the presentation, I also have some recommended readings at the end for those of you who are not yet familiar with post-Keynesian economics, but I guess many in the room already are, in particular sitting in the first row here. Okay, let me start with a distinction between post-Keynesian economics and orthodox economics. And here I largely follow what you can find in chapter 1 of Marc Lavoie's Post-Keynesian Economics Foundation book, in which Marc is distinguishing heterodox and orthodox schools according to 5 types of presuppositions in the area of, always a difficult word for me, epistemology and ontology in the area of the concept of rationality, method, economic core, and political core. Let me touch upon these. Oops, that was the wrong. Let me touch upon these in turn. Now, following Lavoie, we can distinguish orthodox and heterodox economics according to epistemology and ontology. And Lavoie's argument is that in heterodox economics, both post-Keynesian, modern Marxist, and if you move to broader economics, also the other heterodox schools, you could argue that heterodox economics is following the concept of realism, which means that the objective of economics is to tell relevant stories and to explain the actual working of the economy in the real world. And Nicholas Calder has famously termed this kind of approach that we should always start with stylized facts, which we then try to explain, try to examine their interrelationships, instead of starting with hypothetical, idealistic positions or assumptions, as we know from orthodox economics and neoclassical economics in particular. The orthodox counterpart to that is the concept of instrumentalism, in which it is argued that economic hypotheses are sound if they allow for calculation of equilibria and for accurate prediction. Milton Friedman is the most famous, probably still most famous proponent of this approach. So that is the justification in orthodox economics to start with these first principles of starting with utility and profit maximizing agents, starting with given endowments, and starting with the assumption of perfect competition. Regarding the concept of rationality, Lavoie argues that in heterodox economics you find the idea of environment-consistent rationality and satisficing agents. This takes into account that individuals are facing severe limitations in their ability to acquire and process information because information is either not known or simply non-existent. From this perspective, expectations then are based on what John Maynard Keynes then called radical uncertainty, which is, as we know, different from probabilistic risk. Therefore, norms and institutions matter as, if you like, rational responses towards this notion of radical uncertainty. The counterpart in orthodox economics is hypermodel consistent rationality and optimizing agents. Here the assumption is that individuals possess quasi-unlimited knowledge and they are able to calculate the economic outcomes of this applying the true model, and the true model is seen as the most advanced orthodox model, which then applies the concept of rational expectations as it is called. Regarding method, the distinction is that in heterodox economics the concept is what Lavoie calls this concept holism and organicism, which means that individuals are seen as social beings under the influence of their environment, so culture, class, gender, institutions, history. And from this, in heterodox economics, in heterodox macroeconomics, you find several micro-macro paradoxes. So the paradox of thrift, which goes back to the work of John Maynard Keynes, the paradox of cost, Michael Kalecki. In Kalecki, you also find this paradox of public deficits, the paradox of debt, which goes back to Irving Fisher and has then been included again in the work by Joseph Steindl, paradox of tranquility, paradox of liquidity, paradox of risk, paradox of profit-led demand, and you could probably add some further. In orthodox economics, the methodological concept is individualism and atomicism, which means that you start with the quasi-pre-social individual and his or her preferences and develop your economic theory from that. You see, or this allows orthodox economics to include or to start with a representative agent as a utility or profit maximizer under constraints, and this allows orthodox economics to claim that macroeconomics always needs to be micro-founded based on this concept. Regarding the economic core, if you go back in the history of economic thought, you see that heterodox economics is based on the notion of production growth. Lavoie adds abundance. I feel a bit uncomfortable with that given the environmental constraints we're facing. But still, the idea is that the focus of economics is the explanation of accumulation, of the creation of the wealth of nations by means of accumulating part of the surplus, as the classicals call it, and by means of technical progress. Prices in this concept are seen as reproduction prices, which have to make sure that costs are covered and that firms make normal profits in order for the system to reproduce. Keynes and Kalecki have added to this the focus on the utilization of accumulated resources because the economy, according to them, does not usually operate at full utilization and full employment. In orthodox theory, you have the alternative concept, which started with starts with the focus economic core, focusing on exchange, allocation, and scarcity. I guess all of you in the room know the famous definition of Robbins, what economics is supposed to be. So it's about the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Prices are assumed to reflect scarcity, and exchange is the starting point of economic analysis. And then later on, of course, you can add production and growth as extensions. Regarding the political core, Lavoie argues that heterodox economics focuses on regulated markets. So the idea is that markets are always embedded in society, markets are always embedded in institutions, and markets as such may generate instabilities, irrespective of whether prices are flexible or not. They generate unacceptable inequalities and inefficiencies. Free markets are impossible as such, and there are always tendencies towards undermining competition through tendencies towards oligopoly and monopoly. Therefore, heterodox economics or heterodox schools claim that markets need to be regulated, and at the aggregate level, demand needs to be managed by the state. In orthodox economics, there's a tendency towards unfettered market, or towards going for unfettered markets. The basic idea is that perfect markets would generate optimal results. State intervention generate inefficiencies. Of course, we know there are exceptions from that as soon as you have external effects or natural monopolies, which then need to be or require government intervention. Now, this is a broad distinction, and it's maybe a bit too broad, and it also does not take into account that the picture is not always black and white, and that there is a lot of gray in between, but it gives us a first orientation. Now, let us, in the second step, now look at the different strands of post-Keynesian economics and see what these different strands of post-Keynesian economics have in common. And again, I follow Lavoie in chapter 1 of his book, where he distinguishes 5 strands in post-Keynesian economics, applying a big tent approach. So this is different from other views you find in post-Keynesian economics, going back, for instance, to a debate which we have had in the early 2000s, when Paul Davids, for instance, claimed that post-Keynesian economics should rather be defined according to some very narrow definition, which would exclude some of these strands which you see here. But if you agree that we should rather look for what unites post-Keynesians than what is splitting post-Keynesians, then we can distinguish these 5 strands. We first have the so-called fundamentalists, so that's John Maynard Keynes, the older John Robinson, Minsky, Jekyll, and Weintraub. And the focus of this strand is on fundamental uncertainty, the feature of a monetary production economy, financial instability, and you find a lot of work on method in this strand. The second strand are the Kaleckians, so Kalecki, Joseph Steindl, and the younger John Robinson, which has been influenced a whole lot by Mikhail Kalecki. And the focus here is on cost-plus pricing, on class conflict, effective demand, income distribution, and growth. The third strand are the so-called Caldorians, with Nicholas Caldor, Roy Harrod, Richard Goodwin, Wynne Gardley, and maybe several others. And the focus here is on growth, on productivity regimes, open economy constraints to growth, and the examination of the interlinkages between the economic and the financial system in a unified model, in particular in the work which has been found, or which in the work by Godley and his followers, the stock flow consistent modeling. The fourth strand are the Sraffians and the Neo-Ricardians, of course inspired by the work of Sraffa and Garignani. The focus here is on prices of production in multi-sectoral systems, choice of technique, capital theory, so the critique of also aggregate neoclassical theory, long period positions of the economy, and recently the idea of using supermultiplier models in order to examine and to explain long-term trends in our economies. A fifth strand is more includes various authors who do not perfectly fit in one of the first four, at least that's my impression. So authors like Veblen, John Kenneth Galbraith, Lerner, and Eichner. And here you find a bit of post-Keynesian microeconomics, so works on pricing, on the theory of the firm, and work on institutions with links then also to behavioral and labor economics. You might have seen or might have recognized I have only included names of people who have passed away. So if you wonder why I put some names here and not others. And I hope I didn't make a mistake. Okay, now summing all this up, so what can be considered to be the core claims of post-Keynesian economics, which makes post-Keynesian economics a distinct school in economics and in heterodox economics in particular. I would argue, of course, post-Keynesians accept the presuppositions of heterodox economics in general, which I have just mentioned. And then there are another 5 core claims, which you find in all strands of post-Keynesian economics, but not necessarily in other heterodox strands of macroeconomics. The first of these additional 5, so then number 6, would be the focus on the monetary theory of production. That's, of course, John Maynard Keynes' work, in which money is non-neutral both in the short run and in the long run, i.e. money is not a veil. The second, or the 7th in my list, would then derive from that the dominance, would be the dominance of the principle of effective demand in the short run and in the long run. Here we have in particular Kalecki adding to that, and of course John Maynard Keynes, and then you have the work on post-Keynesian growth theory by Kaldor, Robinson, and Steindl. The basic claim is here that investment creates the corresponding amount of saving either via income effects, that's in the short run, or via growth and distribution effects in the long run. The 3rd or 8th in the total list would then be the importance of the notion of fundamental uncertainty, which is different from probabilistic risk. So John Maynard Keynes, in his 1937 paper on the general theory, with this famous quote, "We simply do not know." The 4th, or then the 9th, would be the insistence that economic processes take place in historical and irreversible time. That has been pointed out in particular by Joan Robinson in her 1962 book. And this means that economic events are largely path-dependent. So there is no predetermined NAIRU or no predetermined potential growth path towards which the economy will converge in the long run. Kalecki has the famous saying that the long-run trend is but a slowly changing component of a chain of short-period situations. And the 5th or the 10th in the list would be the importance of distributional issues and distributional conflict for economic outcomes. So both for output, employment, inflation, and growth. So summing up, you have these 5 presuppositions and then the 5 core claims, and if you like, you can call that the 10 commandments of post-Keynesian economics, but we are not in church here, so we are doing serious academic work. So this is an attempt at defining post-Keynesian economics and distinguishing post-Keynesian economics also from other heterodox schools. And one of the main distinctions from the Marxist school in macroeconomics, for instance, would be that in at least some strands of the modern Marxist schools, the non-neutrality of money and the principle of effective demand does not hold in the long run. So when they talk about long-run growth trends, for instance. Okay, let me now come to the stages of development of post-Keynesian economics, starting with the work of Keynes and Kalecki in the 1930s and 1940s. So it all started with Kalecki, I would say, and then came Keynes. But unfortunately, Kalecki published his discoveries and his work, his first papers on the principle of effective demand in Polish and not in English, and therefore it was not, became not part of the debate in the English academic circles. And from this perspective, Keynes was more important and, well, for the good or for the bad. But together they provide the revolution in macroeconomics, so the determination of output and employment, involuntary unemployment, and also the trade cycle, focusing on this principle of effective demand. Both Keynes and Kalecki have, in particular towards the end of the Second World War, provided long-run visions, if you like, about economic policies to overcome short and long-run effective demand failures, recession, stagnation, and involuntary unemployment. Both, and again, Keynes is for sure more popular for that, have provided important work on the future of the international currency system after World War II. But we also find, I think, very interesting work of Kalecki together with Schumacher, with similar implication as Keynes's idea of an international clearing union in 1943. In the 30s and 40s, we also have the first attempts by Harrod and Doma to introduce the capacity effect of investment and the impact of the capacity effect on the long-run stability of growth. This is usually what it is claimed that this is the start of post-Keynesian growth theory. But I would rather argue it's the introduction of a capacity effect of investment. It's not yet a full theory of economic growth. In my view, this comes somewhat later. Interestingly, we also find this work, or this introduction of capacity effects of investment, in Kalecki's work on the trade cycle, already in the late 30s and the early 1940s. In this period, in the 1940s, we also have, again, important work by Lerner on functional finance, which has now gained prominence again in the context of MMT. And we find work by Dama on stability conditions for government debt and debt dynamics, on which many of us, or many economists, still refer to. I may skip that. Then in the 50s and 60s, we had the first post-Keynesian distributional growth models by Kaldor and Robinson as a response towards the Solow model, the neoclassical growth model from the early 1950s, and later on also Persinetti, and in which saving adjusts to investment also in the long run through changes in functional income distribution. The assumption here is that in the long run, at least the capital stock in these models is fully utilized. Kaldor in his first models also assumes full employment. Kaldor has then in the 1960s chosen another road or another way to go when it comes to explaining long-run growth trends. He became dissatisfied with these equilibrium models of the late 50s and early 60s and turned towards his applied approach towards growth, focusing in particular on export-led growth, focusing on sectoral and regional divergences, dynamic returns to scale, cumulative causation, path dependence, and all that. In the 50s, we also have the critique of the aggregate neoclassical theory in the Cambridge controversies and the theory of capital, which started with Joan Robinson's 53-54 paper, and which fundamentally challenged the theoretical consistency of aggregate neoclassical macroeconomics, starting with an aggregate production function. It has been shown that the properties of these aggregate production functions do not hold in a more than one good economy, and that all the implications derived from that are built on sand. The 70s have then seen what Giuseppe Fontana, sitting here in the first row in a book in 2009, has called the romantic age of post-Keynesian economics. Maybe he can explain in the debate why he chose this terminology. My reading is that he chose it because this was the period when orthodox economics had troubles in explaining the crisis of post-war capitalism. And it seemed as if this were the historical situation in which there was a need for an alternative school in economics, and post-Keynesians started to unite. Post-Keynesians started to think about what they have in common. When John Robinson visited the US and they had this meeting at, I think, one of the ASA conferences and gathered the North American post-Keynesians, so Davidson, Weintraub, and Kregel and others. And we had the first attempts at defining what post-Keynesian is. What is the post-Keynesian paradigm in economics? We had the first important book by Davidson in 1972, then the Eichner-Kregel paper in the Journal of Economic Literature, later on a book with collected essays by Alfred Eichner. There was also an attempt at providing an introductory textbook by John Robinson and John Eatwell along rather Sraffian post-Keynesian lines, which, well, with hindsight, I would say did not fly. So I think it's still important and interesting to read, but it was not widely used at universities. Since post-Keynesians had increasing problems in publishing in mainstream journals, we saw the foundation of the first and still important, maybe still most important, post-Keynesian journals, or journals which give access to post-Keynesian work, so the Cambridge Journal of Economics and the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. In the 70s, we also have some work on post-Keynesian microeconomics. I'm supposed to focus on macro, but allow me in this more broader overview also to talk a bit about micro. With Eichner, Harcourt-Kenyon's, and Wood's work on the theory of the firm and on pricing, in which they basically claim that the markup in firms' pricing is given by the firm's desire to invest and by the requirement of profits for investment purposes. Another important work which started in the late 1970s and which is still, I think, very relevant, and a lot of people are working on that, is the work by Tony Thirlwall on the balance of payments constraint growth, which then became known as Thirlwall's law, in which he argues that the long-run growth rate of the economy is limited, or even determined, that's still a debate, by foreign income growth and by the income elasticities of exports and imports. And we should not forget, we had Minsky, although not that prominent in this period, but the work which then became very prominent in the 2007-2009 crisis, also in orthodox circles. So we had Minsky's work on Minsky's book on Keynes's work, which already includes the financial instability theory, which basically argues that periods of tranquility breed instability. The 1980s and 1990s, and again I follow Giuseppe's terminology, is then termed by Giuseppe as the age of uncertainty. The high hopes of the 1970s did not come true, as we all know. Instead of the neoclassic synthesis as the dominant school in macroeconomics, we did not get post-Keynesian economics, but we got Milton Friedman and monetarism, and then later on new classical economics. And this made post-Keynesian think about to what extent are we really different from orthodox economics? And you see a lot of work on methods in this period. And you see the first, I would say, textbook-like publications. They are not proper textbooks, but they are textbook-like. And I have a lot of names here. Philip Orestes, Amit Bhadduri, more based on the work of Koletsky, Carvalho, more based on a fundamentalist explanation of Keynes, Chick as well, Davidson, Dutt, Amadeu, Lavoie, and so on, Lee on micro, Tom Palley, Reynolds, and Sawyer. We have the foundation of further journals, so the International Review of Applied Economics and the Review of Political Economy. And we had, although this already started in the 50s in the contributions to the Radcliffe Committee by Kahn and I think also Kaldor, we have the first full elaborations on endogenous money by Kaldor, Lavoie, and then later on in the late 80s by Basil Moore. Unfortunately, with hindsight, this triggered the infamous debate of the horizontalist versus the structuralist on interest rate money and credit, and which is mainly on the slope of the money and the credit supply curve in interest money or interest credit space. Well, there is still some work on this, I noticed recently. I haven't included it here. Maybe the author is here. I think it was Matteo, it was the lady or so. Anyway. We have in this period also the second generation of post-Keynesian distribution and growth models. Remember, in the 50s, we had the first generation, so Kaldor and Robinson. Now we have the second generation based on the works of Kalecki and Joseph Steindl in particular, and the two independent innovators of that are Amitav Haddad and Bob Rowthorne, which treat, in these models, the rate of capacity utilization is treated as an endogenously adjusting variable also in the long run. Build on that, and again, this is something which is still heavily discussed, a lot of empirical work on that. Build on that, but Duri Marklin and also Heinz Kurz have produced some work in which, for a closed economy, you may not only have wage-led growth, as in the Dutt and Rowthorne model, but you may also have a profit-led growth, depending on how exactly you set up the investment function. Robert Blecker has came to similar conclusions already in 1989 in a paper in the Cambridge Journal of Economics for an open economy model. So he chose the effect of distribution with net exports in order to explain that under certain conditions, redistribution in favor of profits may lead to higher demand and higher growth, so that you may have profit-led demand and growth in a Kalecki model. Now we come to the latest period, and you have seen well, I have seen it because Jan had the first issue of the FMM working papers, which was based on my presentation at the FMM conference 2017, I think. Yeah, the 20th anniversary, where I tried to give an overview over the last 20 years of post-Keynesian economics. And what I have here is a summary of that. And I beg your pardon again for the bias which you might find in this summary, because the bias is that this is the period when I have myself worked in post-Keynesian economics, and you may see some, maybe too many references to my own work. The reason is my own work I know best, so so don't take this too seriously. There is a lot of other work, and I tried also to refer to this other work in the paper. Now, what have we seen since the early 2000s? So we have seen in particular a burst of applied work. So post-Keynesians are now using econometric techniques, in particular the younger generation, and you see that in different areas of work, most prominently, but now extending to other areas, on the issue of wage and profit-led demand and growth. So that's one debate. I think it's still going on. There's the debate with the Goodwinians, as Engelbert Stockhammer calls them. So the authors around the New School, and here in Germany around Peter Flaschel, who passed away a couple of days ago, who argued that, who found in their econometric work that demand and growth, but in particular demand in the short run, tends to be profit-led, whereas the Kaleckians tend to find that demand is wage-led, in particular if you ignore the open economy effects, so that domestic demand is wage-led. We've seen another debate on the Kaleckian distribution and growth model, in particular on the treatment of the rate of capacity utilization as an endogenous variable beyond the short run. Several also Goodwinians and Herodians have claimed that this ignores the issue of Herodian instability, and we have seen a debate on that. Later, well, one of the latest developments in the area of distribution and growth, I already mentioned that earlier on, is the use of the Sraffian supermultiplier models or process in Kaleckian distribution and growth models. We've seen a lot of debate on the role of, recently in the context in particular of explaining the process which has led us to the financial and economic crisis 2007-2009, on the role of wage dispersion and household inequality and household debt dynamics, which included the introduction of other consumption functions than the simple Keynesian or Kaleckian or Kaldorian consumption functions into post-Keynesian models, including in particular the idea of relative income concerns into post-Keynesian models. Another level of, or another strand which introduces a segregation or differentiation into post-Keynesian macroeconomics has been the integration of gender into post-Keynesian models, and you see a couple of names here. What else? We've seen full models integrating the analysis of money, finance, distribution, conflict, and effective demand, capital accumulation, and all that, and its application to changing institutional and historical circumstances. That is all the work we've had on financialization. Some of this work has been on, or has used stock flow consistent numerical simulation models based on the work of Godley and Lavoie. Others have rather preferred small-scale analytical models. And again, I think this is research which is still going on. And we have derived in this context different demand and growth regimes, both before and after the crisis. So debt-led private demand boom regimes, as I call them, domestic demand-led regimes, and export-led regimes of different types. Recently, we've seen a very interesting debate in which post-Keynesian economics has linked up with comparative and international political economy, a debate and research on growth drivers. So going, so to speak, beyond what has been analyzed so far, when we defined these different regimes which we have seen before and after the crisis, and looking more detailed, more precisely into the drivers of these regimes. And there, I think this is the current strand of research. We will have, I think, also one session on this in this conference with work by Engelbert Stockhammer and Köhler, and I have also tried to contribute to that with some co-authors. We have a lot of models which now are making use of Minsky's work. I remember we had an interview with Charles Goodhart in one of the first issues of the European Journal of Economics and Economic Policies, maybe 15 years ago or so, in which Goodhart argued Minsky is very interesting, but it's very difficult to model Minsky. Now, the younger generation of post-Keynesians now seem to dare to model Minsky, and we've seen a lot of Minskyan models on financial and economic crises. Maria Nicolaidi and Engelbert Stockhammer a couple of years ago have presented a nice overview over these very different attempts at modeling Harm and Minsky in using dynamic modeling. Another strand which we've seen recently is that post-Keynesians now are taking the ecological constraints more seriously. And therefore, I should have really maybe deleted the abundance as one of the presuppositions, or as a part of one of the presuppositions. of post-Keynesian economics. And post-Keynesians are now taking increasingly serious ecological constraints and the effects of all that on macroeconomic stability. This is part of the focus of this conference, as you are well aware, and we have also some sessions on this here in this conference. Again, different types of models have been used for this purpose. Furthermore, there is a lot of work going on in the area of international and development economics. As I already mentioned, making use of Thorwald's law in particular and further developments. But we also have, since we're in Berlin here, we have a strand in post-Keynesian economics which is based on the work of Hajo Riese at the Free University of Berlin. And in this conference, I've seen there are 2 or even 3 sessions on discussing the relevance of Riese's work for modern Keynesian or post-Keynesian economics. We have seen in particular work on currency hierarchies and in the area of development. Again, you have a lot of names here, some of them here from Berlin. We have seen a lot of textbooks and textbook-like monographs in the recent years. Again, I don't want to read the full list. And what I think is very important for the identity of post-Keynesian economics as a distinct school of thought, we have seen, in particular, thanks to the efforts of Tony Thorwald, with Palgrave Macmillan, we've seen a lot of intellectual biographies of post-Keynesian biographies on post-Keynesian economists, not only in Thorwald's edition with Palgrave Macmillan, but also with other publishers. And you see the names here. I don't want to read them. For me, it was also important in the early 2000s to read the books on the history of post-Keynesian economics by Harcourt, King, and Pasinetti. And we have new journals, new kids on the block, which are not so new anymore, namely Egypt, which you've already seen, and also the Review of Keynesian Economics, founded in 2012. Now, what is the current state of post-Keynesian economics against this development, or looking at this development? Where are we currently standing? I would argue that post-Keynesian economics over the last decades has provided a solid set of alternative to the mainstream theories in the area of macroeconomics, in the area of output, employment, unemployment, distribution, growth, technical change, money, credit, and finance, international money and finance, financialization, financial instability and crises, European economics and economic policies, and also on development and emerging market economics. This has provided us with the foundations for a solid critique of the dominant mainstream new consensus macroeconomics, which has dominated the mainstream since the late 1990s, early 2000s. A critique which was articulated well before the 2007-2009 crisis, which showed the limits of this approach. We have developed full-scale post-Keynesian alternative models and alternative macroeconomic policy recommendation, a post-Keynesian alternative macroeconomic policy mix. Philip Orestes and Malcolm Sawyer were prominent here, and with Engelbert Stockham also tried to provide some ideas or some models on this. We have tried to specify these models for the specific conditions of the Eurozone with these incomplete unification in economic terms. And in the US, you've seen since a couple of years, or for a couple of years, the development of MMT, which I would consider to be part of post-Keynesian economics, but which now is, has got prominence under the new brand of modern money theory, which has also had an impact on the policy debate. You see the names here. Now, what are the main differences in terms of economic policies if we compare the post-Keynesian approach towards new consensus macroeconomics? Now, in the new consensus macroeconomics, you have a clear, at least in the long run, division of labor between the different areas of policy making. and a clear allocation of policymakers, policy tools to the goals or the targets of policies. At the core is, in new consensus macroeconomics, you have the labor market and the determination of the Nauru in the long run in this labor market together with the institutional environment of this labor market. And everything is organized around this concept. Central banks only have a short-run effect through inflation targeting on the level of employment, and in the long run, central banks will only affect the rate of inflation. Fiscal policy in this basic approach, although we see later developments in which fiscal policies then becomes a role in very deep recessions, in which monetary policies, interest rate policies faces its limitations. But in the basic concept, fiscal policy is more or less downgraded and is meant to support monetary policy by means of balancing the budget over the cycle. In the area of international economics, you see that the idea rather is that free trade, free capital flows, and flexible exchange rates would support the domestic NCM policy approach. So you have a clear assignment in the long run. Coordination is at best only required in the short run. Now, in the post-Keynesian approach, the idea is that there is no clear assignment, so you cannot clearly assign policymaker instrument to the target variables, because the target variables, i.e. employment and inflation in the short run, are affected by all areas of policy making. So no clear assignment, and therefore economic policy coordination is required, both in the short run and in the long run, and that is not only true for the national level, but also for the international level. In this approach, the policymakers should follow, and we can develop that based on a post-Keynesian macro model, policymakers should follow the following strategies. So for monetary policy, the strategy would be to target low interest rates, which mainly affect distribution in this view, and would be to focus on stability in the financial sector, applying other instruments than the interest rate. Its role as the role of the central bank as lender of last resort, credit controls, and all that. Fiscal policy gains importance in the post-Keynesian approach because fiscal policy is or should support real stabilization in the short and in the long run, with no autonomous deficit targets. This means basically following a functional finance approach as initially proposed by Lerner and also now advocated by MMT. The labor market and wage policies would be mainly responsible for stable inflation and stable income distribution. The focus should be on a stable development of nominal wages, on steady nominal unit labor cost growth, and on a compressed wage structure. And for international economics, post-Keynesians would rather be in favor of regulated capital flows, managed exchange rates, infant industry protection, regional and industrial policies, in particular if you follow the recommendations which are included in Thirlwald's approach. Now, this is maybe, again, too broad because it does not pay sufficient attention to the macroeconomic policy debates which we have had within post-Keynesian economics. And I only want to focus on, well, I would just highlight some of them in the four areas of policymaking. In the area of monetary policy, we've seen a debate which between activist and parking approaches, as Rochon and Setterfield have called them, a debate which is mainly on the role of the use of the rate of interest. Whereas the parking approach argues that central banks should not make use of the rate of interest in order to short-term manage the economy and should rather focus on parking the rate of interest, in particular focusing on the long-term rate of interest at a certain level. Others, like Tom Pally and I think also Giuseppe Fontana, had argued that it would make sense still to use the rate of interest as a short-run policy tool, albeit in a more growth-oriented fashion. But I think there's broad agreement, irrespective of whether you follow the activist or the parking it approach, that the interest rate policies face severe limitations, as we've seen in the recent crises, I must say, so both the 2007-2009 crisis and also the 2020 COVID crisis. And I think there's also broad agreement that the other policy tools the central bank has at hand in order to, or things to have at hand in order to push or to support the macroeconomy, face severe limitations. What do I mean by that? Quantitative easing. So I think there's also broad agreement that the real effect of quantitative easing is rather limited, and therefore that even if you consider that monetary policies can be used for short-run management, the focus would always be on fiscal policy. So the focus would always be on making use of fiscal policy in order to stabilize the economy. In that area, we've seen a fierce debate, I would say. Well, I wouldn't call it a proper debate. It's just people criticizing each other without, maybe at different levels of the argument, between the MMT proponents and some other post-Keynesians who have been rather critical of functional finance, and maybe Tom Pally is very prominent in this respect. So there is no fundamental agreement on that, but there is still a debate going on. There's also some debate going on in the area of wage policy between I would say the fundamentalist Keynesians and the Kaleckians, according to what wage policies can achieve indeed. Whereas the Kaleckians argue that wage policy may also have an impact on income distribution, the fundamentalist Keynesians tend to argue that wage policy is rather impotent when it comes to affecting functional income distribution, and that therefore wage policy should be focused exclusively towards nominal stabilization, and that the distribution issues should be tackled by means of other policy instruments. Finally, in the area of international economic policy, we also have a debate involving MMT again on the role of the exchange rate system, where, as I argued, I think the majority of post-Keynesians would argue that we should go for a system of managed exchange rates and capital controls. In MMT, at least with some MMT authors, there is the view that floating exchange rates could allow for using fiscal policy in the functional finance way, which is recommended by MMT. I have to say, this is, and the debate has been clarified in the last couple of years, this is only true from the MMT perspective for countries with a sovereign currency. As soon as you run into debt in foreign currency, then I think also MMT proponents would argue that floating exchange rates will not do the trick. A few words on micro, although this overview was supposed to be on macro and on political economy. I have talked my overview has been most on macroeconomics. However, I have mentioned the 1970s when we had the post-Keynesian theory of the firm and post-Keynesian pricing theory, and I've mentioned also the latest developments in which post-Keynesians have integrated alternative consumption functions in their models. So consumption functions relying on the relative income hypothesis. And this is also based on observations regarding real behavior of households, in the 70s, real behavior of firms, and this is micro. So post-Keynesians have a micro theory, and I think John King has been one of the most elaborate on that, arguing that, of course, there is a post-Keynesian micro. Fred Lee has a great book on post-Keynesian pricing theory, and he has worked on that for years till he passed away. So there is micro. And you can even define some basic principles of post-Keynesian micro, following John King, who argues that in post-Keynesian micro, well, the basic principles of post-Keynesian micro include that the decisions of the firms are the driving force, that in the markets we usually have oligopolistic or monopolistic competition, and that behavior, both of households and firms, is based on fundamental uncertainty and satisficing behavior. We had included that in one of the presuppositions in the list of law. The question then is, should post-Keynesians propose the macro foundations of macroeconomics as the alternative of orthodox economics, starting with the micro foundations of macroeconomics? I here would side with King, who argued that we should go for neither nor. And I just read King's quote, which I find quite illuminating here, who brings it, clearly spells this out. And he argues that, as Kalecki maintained, macroeconomics and microeconomics should be thought of as existing side by side, closely related to and influencing each other, but also relatively autonomous and neither constituting the foundations of the other. So I would side with this view. So of course we have to do micro. We have to include in particular the changes in institutions and behavior, also in our macro models. But this doesn't mean that we should go for a strict micro foundation in the orthodox sense. Macro has a life and has a justification in its own. For this purpose, post-Keynesians should, of course, draw on other schools of thought, experimental economics, behavioral economics, and in particular on the work of other social sciences. I've mentioned the interesting work we are currently having, or the exchange we are currently having with comparative political economy and international political economy, and I think this is the way to go forward. And I think what post-Keynesians could contribute is the macro dimension. So post-Keynesians can provide the macro for a broader political economy program. Let me finish with a few words on the post-Keynesian institutional academic infrastructure. If we look at the current state of post-Keynesian economics, we could argue that post-Keynesian economics has survived as a contested and embattled minority in economics. We have managed to develop an academic infrastructure as part of heterodox economics in general, or as part of a political economy research program in general. This includes a rich list of textbooks and intellectual biographies. I've mentioned them. This includes a set of journals to which post-Keynesians have access to, or which they are editing themselves. This includes the establishment of networks, associations, conferences, and summer schools. This is one of these conferences, and it includes the establishment of graduate programs. I have compiled a list, but I don't want to read that here. The files will be, or the slides will be uploaded. Again, I don't claim that this is comprehensive, and the order is random, I would say. We have a lot of networks, North America, South America. Maybe I missed something. I now know that in South America there's also in Argentina there's a post-Keynesian network being established. We have something in Australia, Asia, UK, Denmark, and the European countries. I would claim that the Forum Macroeconomics and Macroeconomic Policies, which organizes this conference and this workshop, is part of that. We have a lot of graduate programs with relevant post-Keynesian content. Again, I don't claim this is comprehensive. So South America, the US, UK, France, Italy, also in Germany. Well, this is, I think, something I should mention because the latest call has just come out. We are very proud to have now the next edition of the Erasmus Mundus master program. We had the first one on economic policies in the age of globalization, and now starting last year we now have the second edition, if you like, of an Erasmus Mundus master program called Economic Policies of the Global Transition, and the call for application has just come out. You may have received it via several mailing lists or newsletters. Now, let me finish now with what are the perspectives of post-Keynesian economics. To my reading, there are ways in which this is discussed. Currently, we're not discussing this so intensively, I feel. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I missed some of the literature. But we have seen an intense discussion more or less 10 years ago on what is the perspective of post-Keynesian economics. We could maybe Giuseppe has an idea how to call this period. So post-Keynesians who had good explanations on the reasons and causes of the 2007-2009 crisis. Post-Keynesians who had good ideas on economic policies after the crisis, several proposals of a new Keynesian deal or a global Keynesian deal, or with different wordings, different headlines. But as usual, it didn't come true. We neither gained much ground in academics, nor did we have a significant impact on policymaking, except for maybe a short window in the course and after the 2007 and 2009 crises. This was also, since Giuseppe is sitting here, when we got one of the biggest grants the European Commission has provided in their research programs, and we could do the FESOD project, so the project on financialization, economy, society, and sustainable development, a project over 5 years with 15 or 16 institutions from 14 countries, or I think, if I'm not completely mistaken, involved. But this was a short window of opportunity, and now it seems that we can discuss that, and I will leave some time for the discussion here. We can discuss that later on. It seems that this window has closed again after this crisis. Maybe it's now open again with the COVID crisis. This is, I guess, a matter of debate. But this has then triggered, again, a debate among post-Keynesians and others on the perspectives. And we have seen several contributions to that. Again, maybe Giuseppe, you should have given this talk. Giuseppe Fontana contributing to that, Colander. We have had these discussions here at this conference in this period on how to go forward with post-Keynesian economics. And Colander, and correct me if I'm wrong, putting you in this camp, Giuseppe with co-authors have argued that post-Keynesians should maybe focus a bit more on what's going on in orthodox economics. They should, I think that was rather Colander's argument, should avoid attacking a textbook straw man, and they should rather look at the most recent developments in orthodox economics. They should adapt their modeling methods towards what is being used in orthodox economics in order to gain ground in the debate with mainstream economics and to gain acceptance in mainstream economics. So try to engage in dialogues and try to cooperate with mainstream economics. Others have argued that this is the wrong way to go. Paul Davidson has always and continuously argued that post-Keynesians should follow their research programs, which in his view is a more narrow one, and they should actively fight orthodox economics and convince them that they're wrong. Fred Lee used to argue that, well, we should just ignore what's going on in mainstream economics and we should do our research to come up with a better explanation of the world. Well, maybe these are the three extreme views, if you like. John King, again, who has dealt with this extensively, has argued that we should avoid fundamental methodological debates and we should avoid a sectarian intolerance. So this is maybe a bit in between the three. So of course we need to look at what's going on in the mainstream, but we should maybe not naive in believing that we could have an impact on it. Stockhammer and Ramskogler, in a paper in Egypt, the journal which you have seen here, have argued that in a more political economy approach, have argued that the mainstream economists wouldn't have any interest in a dialogue with heterodox economics and post-Keynesian economics in particular, and therefore it's not our choice. It's not our choice whether we will have a debate with them. They will exclude us, and therefore post-Keynesians should focus on useful explanations of ongoing socioeconomic transformations. They should cooperate with other heterodox approaches and discuss with the mainstream where possible in order to have an impact, not to convince them that they are wrong, but in order to have an impact on policies, to have an impact on the social development and on economic policies. Well, if you like my view on that, which is again a bit in between, I think post-Keynesians should improve their research program in those areas which are underdeveloped without giving up our strength in macroeconomics, because as I've argued before, what post-Keynesians can contribute to an alternative political economy program is the dimension of macro. We should explore the links with modern experimental and behavioral economics, should look at their results, of course. Topic-wise, we should work further on the integration of ecological constraints. This conference is meant to contribute to that. We need to further take on board social segregation tendencies. I've mentioned this already in the area of gender, but there are others as well. And we should look at the political economy dimension. I mentioned, for instance, the recent work or exchanges with comparative political economy and international political economy. So we should improve the dialogue and the cooperation with other heterodox schools, like ecological economics, institutional economics, also the different strands of Marxian economics, so the French regulation school, the SSA school in the US, with critical and comparative political economy and international political economy. And the aim should be a pluralist political economy research program as an alternative to orthodoxy. I think this is the content. And having worked with the Berlin School of Economics and Law since 2009, which used to be one of the remaining heterodox departments of economics in Germany, I can now also say this with even more focus, with even underlining this more. We need to focus and concentrate on defending and improving our heterodox academic infrastructure. And this includes university positions. At the Berlin School of Economics, we have been marginalized over the last couple of years. We were not successful in defending the positions which we had. This includes research funding, graduate programs, journals, and also appropriate journal rankings, association networks, conferences, and summer schools. And we need to maintain improved cooperations with the social movements, so trade unions, political parties, as well as with research institutes and think tanks outside the university. So that's also part of the history of the FMM, which is a cooperation of a trade union-related research institute funded by the Böckler Foundation with heterodox economists based at several universities. And we need to participate in public debates. Maybe this is self-evident, but let me mention this nonetheless. Okay, that's it from my side. Tour d'horizon through the development of post-Keynesian economics over the last 70 years, with some ideas where we currently are and some outlook for future developments. Before I finish, I don't want to go through that. I have because I have here a list of readings on post-Keynesian economics, both at the introductory level, so some introductory textbooks, or a collection of essays at a textbook level. I have some, so also trying to allocate them according to the different strands of post-Keynesian economics. And I have some more advanced textbooks or collection of essays in general and in the area of distribution and growth and MMT in particular. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this is helpful, or this was helpful, and I'm available for debates and discussions.
I am a teacher. I can use my teacher voice.
Okay.
On the policy, I would say the window opened and did not entirely shrink. To think of it in terms of what's called the Overton window, what is permissible to discuss. So in my view, there's kind of two ways you can enter policy. One is back office analysis. That's where I work. And the Overton window has stretched so that I am permitted to apply these methods in the back office. Then there's high-end policy. And with this, the MMT phenomenon is a classic example of where an active proponent puts forward an idea, it catches the imagination, and then there is a backlash from others in the academy who would otherwise maybe be supportive, but are criticizing the details. That's actually a classic development. And then it gets more complex, and then you get a richer picture. But the fact that that was opened up is to me, just fantastic, regardless of how it ends up in the long run.
Okay, this was more a comment, and I would agree with that. And I didn't want to be too pessimistic at the end, so maybe I tend to be, given the experience over the last 30 years or so. I would agree. I mean, with the corona crises, with the ecological crises, there is increasing awareness in the policy arena that something needs to be changed. I think that's true. That's true. And maybe there is also an increasing openness to listen to alternative views. That's also true. But what I miss so far, and having suffered from that at my university over the last years, is that this has an impact on academics, so that this feeds back on our positions in the academic arena. I don't see a massive grants to heterodox networks, heterodox consortia. I don't see the opening of positions at orthodox-dominated universities. I don't see that on a broad scale. Of course, there are bits and pieces here and there, and I don't want to discourage the younger generation here in this room. I mean, you have to keep on fighting. You have to do the good thing. But you have to be aware that there's no free lunch in this respect. I mean, you have to fight, and you have to take the opportunity of these windows which do open, and maybe it's still somewhat open. So that's maybe thank you for this. So I don't want to finish with a very pessimistic message. Maybe that was an impression I gave, and I should revise that. Thank you.
Eckhard, if I can ask a question. Well, first of all, I should say that I loved your presentation, and there are so many good things that it will take hours just to comment on all the good things you have said. There is only one thing that maybe for reason of time you didn't stress enough, and in terms of perspective, it is true the way you represent my way of thinking about whatever I've done in post-Keynesian economics was always to engage with open mind mainstream. And in part, I think I was following the advice of other economists like maybe Jeff Harkert, Philip Paresi. They've always been, in a sense, guiding me through my research. But there was always one individual that I knew very well, Randy Ray. And Randy always had the view that, oh, you're wasting your time. What you have to do, and I think it's not reflected completely in your slides, is ignore the mainstream economist and talk to the policymakers. So that, I think, it's completely a different approach. And I have to say, history has gave justice to Randy's approach. So he never really bothered, never, to talk to a mainstream economist, even in his own department. He just always talked to a policymaker. And Stephanie and Pavlina have always done that. And in a sense, you mentioned this as a possibility. And I think that's another strategy. It's not, I don't think it's a substitute for the other, but that's one other way I think the young generation can think about, having a solid understanding, of course, of the economics, but engage directly with the policymaker, because, you know, I've been attending often the American Economic Association, and the first time, really, in the last few years, I could see mainstream economists talking about heterodox economics, because they were forced by policymakers. So policymaker will ask them, what do you think about MMT? And I remember there was a session organized by the Fed, and there were, you know, all the good and the great in mainstream monetary economics and in the central banking. And the question were about the MMT, and I would say, I can't believe that. They were forced to engage against their will because the policymaker will force them to say, what do you think about MMT? It's useless. And that's another strategy, I think, you know, for young people. Of course, I think I will say they have to have a solid knowledge of economics and post-Keynesian economics, and then maybe get a different view, like Tom Pally and so on. But I think that's another strategy. Now, Randy pushed the functional finance. I think another tool that we could push is ecological macro. I think there, the younger generation, building on the post-Keynesian economics tradition, can open up, again, talking to the policymaker directly, how to face the real-world challenge of climate change and ecological issues, use the tool of post-Keynesian economics, and then force the mainstream that still dominate the debate with the policymakers, say, okay, there is a different views. And so then the mainstream have to go back, in a sense, and learn what the post-Keynesian are saying. So that's another strategy. I don't think it's a substitute for engaging, as I like, and Jeff Harkert and Philip Paresi have always done with open-minded mainstream economists, but I think it's a strategy that has validity, and I think Randy was right, and, you know, that is another strategy for the future. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I would agree with that, because this means that basically what also Stockholm and Ramskola tell us, that you should come up with your own explanation of what's going on and try to engage in public debate and have an impact on economic policies, so advising economic policy makers or trying to get access to them. And then, of course, this kind of debate could then feed back into academics, because if then mainstream economics is forced to tackle or to deal with heterodox approaches, then this would work out. Yeah, of course. I'm not claiming that there is the one route towards success. I would say it's a combination of all three of them, and each of us will have to make a decision what his or her comparative advantage, in a sense, may be, because time is scarce and we can't, at least individually, we can't do everything. So at least that's my impression. But I agree. Further hands? Yeah. The microphone is where?
She has it.
Okay. I haven't seen you, of course. Then.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It was a nice recap from class at some points.
The PK part is to come, so that's next week. Okay.
I was wondering if you could briefly go into detail about the gender perspective you mentioned. I think you put your own name in the references as well. Yeah. So what is new? What is changing? What can we expect?
What is new? What is changing? What can we expect? Now, I would not put myself at the first place here. I know my own work best, so that's why I put it. Where have I, what have I gendered? Yeah, here. Now, there's interesting work going on and has been going on, and I should have mentioned more names, of course. It's Elissa Brownstein, Stephanie Seguino, and others, and co-authors who have worked on gendered macro, Özlem Onaran recently also, who have worked on gendered macro models. And I have just made a little attempt at integrating a gender division, the gender pay gap, into our basic Kaleckian distribution and growth models at different levels for closed economy, and open economy with technological progress. And then you can show, depending on saving propensities of male and female workers, you can show that different regimes may emerge, and you can include the potential effect of care work on human capital, or as I think Seguino and Brownstein call it, human capacity, which will then have an impact also on long-run growth. So that is what I have done, and the others have done much more, because they have related that to different institutional environments and circumstances. For instance, to developing or emerging economies with dual labor markets, with sectoral differences and all that. So I would argue, well, those people have done much more work than I have done, and I've just done a little contribution in order to integrate that into the models we know, to see the channels which gender or also other sorts of segregation may have on the model results we know from our basic Kaleckian or post-Kaleckian distribution and growth models. There was a hand here.
So thank you very much for your presentation, and I think I've learned a lot, and I have a bit of an outside view coming more from a complex systems modeling side. So I'm wondering whether there is a dialogue between the post-Keynesian macroeconomics and let's say mainstream economics on where the different types of models and different types of assumptions should be are best applied, or if it's rather that that the two areas claim that the other models are too wrong to be applied.
Too wrong to be. No, I think there is a bit of debate, and two things come to my mind. The first thing is, again, Giuseppe is sitting here in front of me, and Giuseppe, together with Mark Setterfield, have edited a book 10 years ago, 12 years ago, on macro, inviting the leading new consensus macroeconomists, so Karlin Soskic and others, to contribute, and inviting some post-Keynesians to contribute. But I think there was little development out of this, maybe less than you had hoped, I fear. But maybe you can share this. So there have been attempts at having post-Keynesians and orthodox or critical orthodox economists talk to each other. This conference can also be seen as such an attempt. We have had panels in which even really orthodox people were present and have presented their views, and this was then debated. I remember we had, well, I'm bad with names, I would have to look at the programs, but this conference has made these attempts. And some open-minded orthodox economists are willing to do that, are willing to enter this debate, but rather in an attempt to tell us that we are either wrong or what we are claiming is already integrated in the latest development of orthodox economics. So there is a communication problem, or maybe also a problem of real openness in terms of this debate. Again, there are exceptions, and as I said, the world is not black and white. There's a lot of gray in between, and there are exceptions from that. I don't want to say too much on that, because We have some debates with behavioral economists who, maybe from their methodological foundation, are rather starting from orthodox economics, the way I define it, but then look at deviations from that, from these purely maximizing behavior. And there is a bit of debate going on in that area. So it's not completely out of touch, I would say. There is a bit of it, but I wish there were more. I mean, I wish there were more, and there were more openness, in particular, on the orthodox side, in particular. Well, they are in the position that they do not necessarily have to engage with us. That's the comfortable position if you are the majority in your discipline. And maybe my view is a bit too much German and too much biased by the German experience. Maybe in the US or the UK things are a bit different.
Thank you for your presentation. One thing you didn't speak about, maybe try this one. Maybe it's, I don't know if you can call it a strain of post-Keynesian economics, but the circuitist approach from French or Italian economics, and I would like to hear you about your view on the role of the circuitist approach in post-Keynesian economics.
Yeah, I've heard about the circuitist approach, and in fact, I'm using it. I'm using it in my own work. I'm currently, I mean, this is a chapter 2 of my book, which I'm currently doing. And in chapter 3, I have a sub-chapter on the circuitist approach. And I've learned a lot from, I've learned a lot from the work by Graziani in particular, and others. And I think they have you now want me to make it a 6th strand in post-Keynesian economics. Well, I could think about it. Maybe it's included in one of the other strands. In a sense, the real side seems to be rather Kaleckian in at least some of the circuitist work I know. The monetary side is not properly fundamentalist, because in the circuitist it's not so much of allocating stocks according to the degree of uncertainty, but it's more of the flows, so generating credit at the beginning of the circuit and destroying credit at the end of the circuit. So it's a monetary approach which is maybe in between these different strands. So again, I think your example tells us that these strands are rather first attempt, and there are a lot of post-Keynesian work which is difficult to allocate to one of these 5 strands, because it's using elements of several of these strands. The same is true for modern authors, so that's the reason why I have not made the effort of allocating modern authors to these different strands. If you look into the Lavoie textbook, you will find that, but then he also has to make the caveat that there are some important authors who cannot be allocated to these strands because they are using different bits and pieces from these different strands. But I would consider the monetary circuit approach to be part of post-Keynesian economics, to get this clear. And I think it's an important part because it clarifies in particular the relationship between finance, investment, and saving, something which becomes much clearer if you use a monetary circuit approach. And yeah. Further questions or comments?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much for your excellent summary of the field of post-Keynesian economics, which was very useful, at least for me. I wondered, could you maybe highlight the main divergence that you see between post-Keynesian economics and ecological economics?
I do think that there is a lot post-Keynesians and ecological economics has in common. So Cronenberg, 2009, I think, is a nice paper on that. So if you look at the presuppositions, as Lavoie would call them, I think there is a lot what we have in common. What I miss in ecological economics is the macro dimension. So I think that's what post-Keynesians can contribute, and where we have something to add on what's going on in ecological economics. So to look at the not only at the ecological constraint, but also to look at the implications this has for financial stability, this has for full employment, and so what the implications this has for, if you like, the financial market and the labor market. And that's the work, I think, which several of us have now started to do, and there is much more to be done. So that's how I see it. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I should read more in that area. I've just started to do the research in that area. Yeah.
May I briefly comment on that?
Yeah, please.
I'm an ecological economist. I fully agree. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Further questions or comments? There's one.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Professor. And I was thinking about the general differentiation between micro and macroeconomics. And I believe this can be a misleading concept, especially for our heterodox approach. Why? And so I would like to receive your feedback on this, because I was thinking that, especially following this presentation, I've been impressed by an over-increasing complexity of our theoretical approach. And I would like to ask you whether it should be useful to recover the, I would say, clear-cut Garegnani's view on a core theoretical approach in which we determine the relative prices. So this could be the micro part of our history, and then from these determination of relative prices, we can just discover the other issues, so output, employment, whatever we want. So because I believe that starting from solid foundations can be like the way in which a vast majority of people can be directed on these studies. What do you think about?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, I would agree. On the other hand, I think I disagree with what you're saying. Let me explain that. First of all, of course, I agree that you can have a prices of production micro framework, and you then can combine that, and that is what Garegnani has done and several other Sraffians or Neo-Ricardians have done, can combine that with, first of all, different closures, so different theories of distribution, and second, you can try to combine that with the theory of aggregate demand and growth. That is where I agree. I don't think I agree that we should always start with a long period position in which profit rates have equalized across sectors and take that as the micro foundation of our macro models. Because this, in a sense, is a very unrealistic, let's say. I mean, at the end of the day, we want to explain what's going on in the real world, right? And so to use the notion of long period positions in order to explain what's going on in the real world, in which this long run is never achieved, never reached, and in which the traverse to which this long run may change the long run equilibrium position, so path dependency. So there I see a problem. There I see the problem. But I have, of course, and I think this was part of my presentation, to say, well, we can have, or we should have, a theory of price in which price is considered as a reproduction price, whether it's a price of production in the classical Neo-Ricardian Marxian tradition is, I think, another issue. Yeah? Because this presupposes that there has been an equalization of the rate of profits across all sectors. So this is something which is, I think, difficult to integrate. For that purpose, I rather prefer starting with Galeckian markup pricing, or what you have, which of course can be translated into, or which have a counterpart in the prices of production, but it does not suppose that the rate of profit is equalized across all sectors. Yeah. Okay. If there are no further questions, then I would say perfect timing, because the time is over, right? It's 12 o'clock. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks also for the interesting debate and the interesting questions. And yeah, I wish we all have a great conference for the days to come. Thank you very much.